Hey, welcome to Coffee Compiler Club. Here today to talk about compilers and type systems and whether or not Java should have delegates and anything else that we love and hate about programming language design and implementation. Um, Everyone's being recorded. We're all be on YouTube up a few hours, done with spiel. I have no set agenda this morning. We were just talking about the differences between Java and C#, and I'm implementing the XTC language in Java, and so I'm mapping between two different type systems, and I was bemoaning the grief there and wondering if it was time to make a fuzzer for typing tests that would try to make all kinds of torture types. And you can imagine such a thing for Java, but I have the quadratic version of that problem. I have two separate languages that are close but not quite, and they have to do a mesh. One's going this way and one's going this way, and
And
doesn't
one of them has
quite.
mixins.
And I haven't even touched mixins. Yeah, I haven't touched mixins. I have a
And
theory on what I'm going to do with mixins, and the theory is going to look like I'm just going to make a new class for every mixin that got mixed. And then that class will just have the extra mixins, but it will look like a Java class after that. And then it won't have anything weird other than what I already have for weirdnesses now. In fact, I could share, if you don't mind, Cameron, I will share some test cases and people can see what
sure,
kind of stupid things I'm looking at and what they mean. But only,
go do it.
yes, see if I can go find my test file. Yes, and I've turned off all the other ones, so I'll just do it anyhow. Let me find share. Da, 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 da. And then people tell me I need to increase font, so hang on. No, 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 no. Okay, so here's a bunch of cases. I'll go turn them all on so they get colorized. I turned off down the ones I don't like. So I have stuff like I have a ecstasy code, so not Java. I'm going to map to Java. I'm going to fix my window height because Emacs and zooming and zoom don't agree. So I have a class, static class. It's nested inside a method, but that just means I do name mangling to get it to Java. Has two type arguments, to and from. The constructor takes an int argument. It's an implicit constructor. I am implementing an interface called appender, which requires me to have an add call. So I can add things to the appender. And the appender is adding floats. So I have to have it. So here's my appender implementation for an add. It does nothing. I don't care. The equals this says it's the function returns self or something stupid, returns the appender itself. Yes, and does no action. So, this is a type test, so that the code doesn't run, doesn't do anything if it runs. And then there's a nested static inner class, which has a reference to the outer class. It looks the same. So one of these is static, one's not. Then I have a make one of these static guys. I have to hand them two concrete types or type variables. They don't have to be concrete. One's int 64, Java long. One's a string. Constructor takes an argument, which is an int. Same for nested. They have properties, which are basically getter methods that are one for every type variable. One of the type variables is the element of the appender, which is concretely a float. So the assert just says that I can actually write code. And Java, the moving this to Java says I have two getters, one in the static class for one for the nested class. The getters return an element happens to be float in both cases. So in this test case, there are 4 or 5 in the description of a class, static class. There are 1, 2 from, int, and float. There are 4 unique types that show up in places.
And one
And
hidden.
and a hidden one from appender, which is the element. So there are 5 unique classes of which appender, his element has been, as a type variable, has been mapped to float. So one of the things happens here is I have to be able to map type variables in ecstasy to other type variables in ecstasy and eventually to a concrete Java type. So there's mappings going on in ecstasy that I have to track, followed by some of them sometimes go to a concrete type. And I lost focus because Theodore rejoined. Basic one is like basic, except here's a concrete is an actual type variable instance. The appender is not float anymore, it's from, which means it maps the one from the other guy. So if I look at the generated code, here we can look at the generated code here. Except I turned it all off. Can I get code out of here without dying? Let me go see here. Not bad, not bad. So current bug of things to go do here. Let's see how far I got down in here. I think I got enough. Yeah. Okay. So let's go find basic 0, see what I get emitting. So I made Java code to standard out and I colorized it. So that's what's going on the bottom buffer. It's just Java code dumped to standard out. So here is a static class for basic 0. It's been name mangled. Sorry, name mangled to basic 0 static class. It has a to, has a from. They extend my base ecstasy object. It extends itself ext object. It implements appender of float. Then there's a bunch of boilerplate, which I'm not going to bother explaining why it exists. There's an element as a getter. This is the ecstasy demands a getter. Here it is. It returns a concrete type float 32. There are getters for the to type and the from type. So to and from are concrete Java instances of the ecstasy classes that I can get as part of the getting a type variable. So next to you can get type variables as a concrete thing and pass them around, use them to go make new objects and the like. And then the appender just says return this, that's pretty obvious. Here's the nested class, it's the same as the regular class, except somewhere buried in here, he takes an instance of the outer class, which is basic. The class is called basic. That's the name of the file. And otherwise, it's identical. So now I want to go down to basic 1 here. Oh, except they get printed in hash table order. Basic 2, try again. Basic 1. Here's basic 1. That's the run class. Here, by the way, is the buried in it is element get for the SC dot. That's static class get and the nested class get element. And then I call the special version of type equivalence that demands the 2 elements be typed like things.
That's the bottom line on the top window. Assert SC element equal NC element.
Yes, yes, right there. That's the code for that guy.
That exactly. So that xtc.x assert is what he generates.
Yes, for the assert code. Yeah, that's the assert. Sorry, there is a double equals right here. There's double equals right here. It turns into a virtual, non-virtual call that demands statically at compile time that both arguments are of the same type. Or you're testing it as if they were type objects, but they can be nested subtypes of type, which is it's a stupid thing to look at this point, and it's not what I'm actually testing. But it shows up in other aspects. That's one of the weird, interesting things about ecstasy that kind of makes sense. Anyhow, I was trying to get to element get here with $from or from $get, and that's
makes sense until you see it in Java.
Yeah, right. So the thing in Java is I say I have dot equals, and I have a dot equals b, and the first thing I do in the dot equals is I say, well, is b an instance of the thing of a? Because if it's not, then I just should fail. Well, this is an asymmetric test because a can be an instance of b or b an instance of a, but not the other way around. And then one of the equals in b will behave differently than the equals on a. So if you take an a and a b and you swap b dot equals a or a dot equals b, you get different answers. And so equals is not commutative in Java. And in ecstasy, it has to be commutative. It is commutative. So that's what that's about, which is not being tested here. Here I'm trying to test that I have a type variable from $get comes out in the nested class 1 because the appenders guy for appender element is actually the from variable, which is whatever type gets set when I make a new nested class. So this gets me the type variable of the from type, as opposed to a known float, like the basic 0, basic 1 has float. Basic 2, I'm crashing and burning on for other reasons. Let's see if I get to basic 3. Did I get to basic 3 here. I did not. So if I turn off basic,
Basic 2 is the complicated one because you're using the map.
yeah, I need to not be
map.
using map. I want to do this task, but without
Eventually.
using map. We can come back to it and look what's complicated about it here. Let's see if I have basic 2 now. Now, what am I choking on? Basic, what did I choke on? Why? Oh, it's not basic 2, it's basic 3. I did get basic 3. Okay. So basic 3 got generated. Let's go find basic 3. Oh, here it is, basic 3. I make an interface. I face base. He extends hasher, which is, or he's generified on hasher, which is itself an interface. Then he has an interface iFace child, which extends iFace base, defines a new type variable called subhash, which extends the old hasher type variable. Then I make a concrete class with natural hasher, which implements hasher normally and is a concrete type variable. And then I make one of these objects and I go get the hasher type and subhash type, and I can't get there is no getter for natural hasher because that is a concrete type, not a type variable. And somewhere buried in here, I have a Java complaint. So if I go find iFace base, if I spell it right, iFace base, okay, here, iFace base. This is the extent of the Java code for it. It says, oh, I'm an iFace base, I'm an interface. I have a hasher, which is not defined here. I'm not using the hasher that comes in. It's its own type variable. And I think that is correct.
And that's kind of hasher extends object, if you will.
Yes.
Where the class for object is called XTC.
Okay. And the class, yes, XTC, consider XTC Java object. Yeah, right. This hasher is its own type variable and is unrelated to this hasher, which I imported. And just we can argue with people. It. I'm sorry?
Just to confuse people.
Yeah, right. Well, I confused myself. I originally put it in and was thinking I was going to have this be that guy. And then after I wrote the code, I realized it wasn't. So it took me a minute to get it right. And then I have iFace child, which is in out of order with iFace space because, like I said, they're omitted. Oh, look at the missing indentation. Okay, I'll have to go fix that. And iFace child says I am a subhash, which is a new type variable that is extending XTC and hasher. And this is valid Java code. How many people here have used the and inside a generic before?
Twice.
Yeah, ever in your life, right?
Yeah.
But it's valid Java code. So subhash implements the interface hasher and is basically Java line object. Anyhow, this whole interface itself extends. Now, it's not implements, it's extends because it's only implements if you have a concrete class implementing interface. But a concrete class extends another concrete class, and an interface extends another interface. So there's a keyword.
Java C actually changes the extends to an implements internally.
Internally, yeah. There is a keyword shmoo here. I have all these funny tests that say, is the left, is the right, is this interface, is that an object? Which one do I pick? Geez, what the hell? And then he has to have, because he's an interface and he wants to implement code, he has to say default. And he has to have a getter for the hasher. And he has to have a getter for subhash. But because hasher comes from extends, he has to have an implementation that gets the abstract hasher out of iFace base. Which is in turn mapped to his own subhash. So anyone who implements iFace child has to implement subhash, but they get hasher already handed to them. And I'm thinking this is correct. Because he extends hasher. Yeah, I think that's correct.
No, I think in this case, though, when you say extends hasher, does it resolve that hasher to the class, the type?
Well, the XTC code says iFace base is a subhash. So when I say give me a hasher down here, this line here, whoops, this line there. If I say give me the hasher type, well, for foo,
yes,
It
So you
must,
actually have two different hashes there, because when you say subhash extends hasher, you mean that the subhash has to be a of the imported hasher, where you say iface base subhash, what you're saying is my subhash is going to be used as the
the implementation for hasher. Now, you could tell me this is the correct XDC semantics or not, and this is why I write these test cases. What the fuck is this supposed to mean? Do I have the supposed to mean correct?
yes, I missed the part where you said extends iface base subhash. So you actually have
Yeah.
hasher on iface child. The hasher type is actually of the hasher interface because of the extra clause you added on iface child.
Right. So if I
So
change
this
the
is
test,
Josh Block would be proud of this in the puzzler's book.
there you go. So if I change this, I'd get a different answer here. Right? Because the hasher is
In that
iface
case, yeah.
basis hasher. And so this guy shouldn't override hasher in the compilation. In the generate code, he shouldn't override hasher. He should instead take the default one you get out of hasher from iface base. Can I edit now? No, I can't because it's a compilation buffer.
I
Yeah.
mean, there's definitely using the same name that has two different meanings within that context is, it means one's gonna have to get chosen over the other. And I can't guarantee that I know those
Okay, I
words.
have to choose the same way the XTC's compiler chooses.
Exactly.
And in some of these cases, I use the same name to verify that my name lookups aren't being done the wrong way.
Right.
Like if everyone's a unique name and I flatten the namespace to all uniques, like the problem goes away.
And it also makes sure that your name mangling is correct.
Yes, and then I have name mangling that has to go on in different places too. Yeah, this is ugly. And then foo down here is a little easier because basic 3 foo mangled extends iface child of natural hasher. So here I bring a new name in, and that's the concrete name, natural hasher. And then I just call the different guys in the thing here. That's basic 1. This where's basic 3's code. Here, I just call hasher get and subhash get. Anyhow, this is what I spent last 2 weeks on. Maybe last 3 weeks with a week off in the middle. It's just like ugly. All right. Somebody else's turn.
Not as confusing as C front output.
Oh God. Yeah, I lived with C front output for a few years. The very earliest hotspot was done on C front, and we switched when somebody first came up, like GCC or somebody came first with a non-C front based. And yeah, debugging when C front failed and gave you crap, debugging through the mangling was ugly.
It was truly the coffee script of its day.
Oh my gosh. Wait, how old are you that you used C front?
I perhaps I sometimes take it like a month to just use an ancient computer, and sometimes I just am like, you know what? Okay, today we are on a 386. Okay, today we are on an 8086 IBM PC.
And you're pulling up the software stack.
Yeah, and I just use the then software stack and limit myself to like, okay, today is 1993. And it means that like I'm 21, but I understand a lot of the old software. Like I have opinions about QBasic. I shouldn't have opinions about QBasic.
I have no opinions on that.
At least the Windows gets better. You won't have advertisements in the start menu. It's probably going to run faster, so maybe good experience.
But things have gotten better overall. There's a lot of whining and complaining. Surely we can do better, but in fact, we have done better.
Things have both gotten better and gotten worse.
Oh, I was saying that Windows gets better when you go back to the 1990s.
Oh, yes.
Less advertisements.
Yes.
Just don't connect it to the internet and it's fine.
Right.
If you go back before NT, then you've gone back too far.
You can
Right.
cut all that stuff out, and I do. Like a new Windows update for me, generally not update, a Windows OS upgrade from 8 to 10 to whatever, 6 to 8, 7 to 8. They all take a day, and the day is spent deleting the crap off and shutting down all the open security holes and deleting all the crap off. And suddenly it's fast and reliable and stable, and I get rebooted because I can't stop Windows Update about once every several months. I forget press this button again now, or we will update you, and it gets me, which it did.
I like Windows 7 is my favorites, and it
Yeah.
did not crash or have driver problems like XP. But the fact that I may have to write my own text editor because none of the text editors suit my needs, I don't think software is getting better. Like I should not be writing my own text editor.
I claim
Yes.
that you haven't widened your horizon quite enough. You should get into Emacs and see what you can do with a text editor. That's also a windowing user interface and an IDE and a GUI and all those things, and has been around for 40 years. It has a lot of the corner cases ironed out.
I don't know if I can wrangle a debugger in
47
Emacs,
years.
but I should
Yeah.
have tried.
Yes, I mean, Hotspot's built with Emacs and GDB, so
Yeah, Emacs's debugging experience is great
Yeah.
for certain languages, and then for others, they just forgot about it. Like JavaScript, good luck debugging JavaScript in Emacs.
Oh, that's
But if you're
true.
doing anything that GCC can touch,
Oh yeah.
well, it's all integrated. It's
all
great.
integrated. Yeah.
All,
It's just
but if you're like debugging Rust or JavaScript, it's like it's a little worse.
Rust ought to get itself sorted out here. You come through
Rust wants LLDB. Rust really is built for LLDB.
Emacs.
because if you
I've never got it working on ARM.
I have an ARM Mac and I've used LLDB to debug Rust in Emacs.
Wow.
is the LLDB
Okay, you're just smarter than me.
like an extent, like a hook for GDB?
LLDB is the debugger built by the LLVM project. It is not based on GDB. It's like its own thing, but they did like take a bunch of the code and just ignore that fact.
Because the a lot of the integrated experience with debugging in Emacs is tied around GDB. And so if they implement the GDB interface internally, then presumably there'd be Emacs.
I'm
I can
unsure
ask
if they
that
do.
question.
So I've used it through so they have the language server protocol, but they also have the DAP, which is the debug adapter protocol.
Yes, that would be the one.
And so I've used LLDB through that.
So there's two
Maybe I
things
should
about
try it.
LLDB. So the interface is actually a lot like GDB, but it was different enough that I couldn't just like tie it into my code. Like there was like a lot of things I had to like tweak, and I didn't want to break anything, so I just like left it separate. And the other issue I had was I have no idea how to do like a pre-prints for LLDB, because GDB you could just they have a Python file. You just tell it how to print, and it looks fine in the debugger. But I have no idea how to do the equivalent in LLDB, because when I write my own like arrays, you can't see it in LLDB. It's just a pointer. In GDB, I wrote a pretty printer, and it was able to show me the array.
Surely they have pretty printer.
I don't know what it is yet. I haven't dug into it,
haven't
but
found
I
it.
was just like
Okay.
wondering.
All right.
There is a
either.
difference. That's the difference, though.
And there is an LLDB Emacs integration. I just went and looked for that and found it. So such things are out there. Not that I've done any Rust. Fine. All right. So Levo, the last thing, you have to get me a Windows version of your IDE.
Yeah. I still don't know how to do a Java DAP or LSP, because it's
thought you had
been
a Java.
so long. Huh?
Thought you had a Java DAP going.
No, it's
Oh.
been so long that I did not know how to start the Java socket, because they have like a module, but I don't remember how to load it, and ChatGPT didn't give me an easy way to do it. And I just thought, okay, let me just get everything else working on Windows. So if there's bugs, I know it's probably going to be related to that and not just like some mistake I made. Like I haven't written a unit test for a long time, and
I didn't mean to guilt you into a giant story either. It's all good.
No, it's no, it's not even that big of a story. I can give a mini updates. It's just words, no demos.
Just yeah, go.
Okay, so last month, if you guys remember, I did a little bit of Windows, and I got DApp working. And then after that, I'm like, I'm just gonna take a week just to do other things besides my editor, try to relax, and I end up doing a standard something kind of like a standard library. The idea was I can unit test that. So when I do my Windows ports, I could just depend on my standard, like my mini standard library for the sockets and pipes. So then it's just like easier to port. And also I can just delete unordered map and a bunch of C++ things that I just didn't really like. So my mini standard library, I only worked on it a week, maybe 2 weeks. It's gonna get rid of a lot of C++ things I don't like. It's gonna be easy to port, and that's the idea with that. Um, and then the past week is I started refactoring my IDE, and basically that's the end of the update. This is just refactoring, and then I'm going to do the unit test.
So you need to come up with a better name instead of mini, like limited standard edition.
Well, I'm calling it standard minus because it's for C++. So and the
Okay.
idea is you won't need to link to the C++ standard. However, I have to because I'm using SIMD JSON, and there was just like enough that I can't easily.
This is like not necessary to use SIMD JSON for anything. Fine.
Yeah, I don't want to write like I have written a JSON deserializer before. I just don't feel
But
like
why
it.
do you need a super
Here's the
high
trick.
performance JSON serializer?
It's because DApp and LSPs they give you
Right.
JSON.
And
Whose
dApps run
LSP
at the
is that
speed
fast?
that I type, which should give you an eon to go deserialize.
Yeah, but what's the alternative? Because I either have to write my own or I have to use another one that's like written in C.
Well,
And
grab a JSON parser. I was just saying that a SIMDI's JSON parser is just not necessary. And actually,
A
okay,
half
JSON
SIMD
parsers are not
JSON
big.
parse. Yeah, like you could do in 300 lines of like the worst C++ I've ever seen, or
Right.
100 lines of decent C++. If you don't need to parse like, oh, my floats are in hexadecimal,
Yeah.
you're gonna be fine. If your DApp doesn't actually output like most of JSON, the trick is you don't parse JSON, you just parse the things it outputs that isn't JSON. You just go, oh yeah, it puts 20 bytes before the actual number. So I go 20 bytes ahead, read the number, and then 18 bytes after that. And you don't care that it's JSON, it's just a binary format that happens to look like JSON. And it's so much faster than the actual JSON
Did
parser.
JSON actually have a hexadecimal float now?
no.
I think
No, it doesn't.
I think they don't, but like they have other things that are just annoying.
Well, I know there's
Like-
like a infinity and positive, negative, zero issues were going around, and like, okay, they could have done IEEE standard, whatever, but hexadecimal float. Never
So
mind.
parsing
I think
JSON
I'm-
according to the RFC is actually not that difficult. I think Inco's JSON parser, actually before I say, let me quickly look it up how big it is. It's about 100 lines of code, including some white space. And I think that's excluding. Oh, sorry, that's it's the wrapper parser. Sorry. Let's call let's say 500 lines of code, excluding white space comments, that sort of thing. The difficult part is strings because of all the escape sequences that it can has. Numbers are not that big of a deal because for the most part, the way, for example, floats are parsed in JSON, it basically matches what most languages do. So if you can sort of determine the range that the number occupies, you can just pull it straight through your language's float parsing routine, basically. Similar with ints, it's strings are a bit tricky because of the escape sequences. And the tricky part that because you have to do replacements, you can't do it without allocating. But it's not that difficult actually. And if you only care about serialization, it's even easier. You can do it a couple of hundred lines, maybe. So for example, in my compiler, I needed to serialize a bunch of data structures to JSON so that I could basically generate documentation files. And rather than, in this case, with Rust slapping sorted JSON on top of it, which adds like a billion lines of code, 200 dependencies, and God knows what it does, I wrote my own serializer, and it's like, I don't know, 50 lines of code minus sort of the formatting pedantics. So I think you need to have a very special case to need SIMD JSON or anything sort of close to that kind of level of performance. Because especially in the context of language servers, debug adapter protocols, the time spent is going to be mainly dictated by whatever the compiler is doing. Right. So if you want to have, I don't know, type information as you type or as you hover on things, just the process of producing that, that's going to be like 95% of your time. The JSON part is like 1%, maybe.
Trying to work on it.
I don't know
If your
though, because
language is
the LSP mode in Emacs, I know the maintainer, he said the biggest struggle there is trying to get JSON parsing done, and they've done some speed ups to how Emacs parses JSON. But they made like their own custom version of Emacs that has a built-in JSON parser to parse the LSP because it was such a big bottleneck.
They're parsing it with eLisp?
No, they're parsing it with libjensen, but it was still too slow.
Wow. How much JSON are they parsing?
Well, some LSP servers can be really, really noisy. And
Especially if you do a syntax or a semantic.
Syntax highlighting and semantic tokens and stuff.
Oh, I see.
Right,
you can just
that
ignore
is
those,
true.
though.
For example, Rust Analyzer, depending on, of course, the size of your project and such, but if you look at the things it logs, so if in the case of NeoVim, you turn logging on, you can see all the data that gets sent back and forth. And that's a case where Rust Analyzer is, I don't know if it's an LSP spec requirement or Rust Analyzer, but when you trigger completions, for example, it'll just shoot like thousands of JSON blobs for each method, thing, whatever it's potentially completing. And then you on the client side have to filter that out. So there's a case where you can get pretty big payloads, but
Yeah, but what you do there is you don't write a JSON parser, you just write a bracket matcher, and you go to the ending bracket once you've found one that's like suitable.
You're gonna end up shooting yourself in the foot because that
No,
will work
no.
until you complete a method that includes a bracket somewhere in the documentation or something like that.
Don't do that.
I'm with Shaw on this one though.
Just send it data that doesn't have that, and it'll send you back data that doesn't have that.
Yeah, but that's kind of like telling people like, just don't write buggy software.
You write Rust. It has
no. So what I mean is the case, right? So let's say you have the vector type. You want to complete a bunch of methods. The way this works in the LSP is you don't say, hey, here's my query string, give me all the matching entries. You basically say, here's a prefix, vec, colon, or array dot, or whatever. Give me all possible candidates, and then I will filter those out. For each candidate, it's not just the method name, right? The LSP's protocol mandates that it includes a bunch of things like the name. I think the documentation is optional. Like if there is none, obviously you don't include it. You get some sort of hints for like how you can do filtering and sorting and a bunch of metadata, etc. And so it is possible that JSON blob in the documentation contains all kinds of special funny characters for Markdown and code examples. And
I would just strip those before I tell the LSP about them.
Right, but then you still need to parse it as JSON. Because if
I
you just do some dumb counting mechanism where you try to balance parentheses or curly braces or whatever.
You just don't send it strings that have parentheses in them. Like, why does completion need to know about the internals of your strings?
No. You're misunderstanding, right? Part of it is the documentation. That can include whatever garbage people write as part of the documentation. That you want to include so that you can show it when, for example, going through completions.
I think there's a difference here. And one of them is there's a time and place for like a giant wad comes and I have a timeliness to go highlight the right thing. Then there's a separate thing where I'm staring and thinking about it. Now I want to see some documentation somewhere, whatever. That took a full second or two before my brain kind of came around to maybe it's time to pop up the docs.
Right. So I am all for splitting concerns, right? So I think it makes sense that you make a distinction in your protocol between a call that says just give me the candidates and a call that says, hey, give me the extra details for this specific candidate, right? I'm totally with that. The thing is, that's not how LSP works. So you can argue like, don't do that. It's like, well, then you have to go write your own LSP protocol. Nobody
No,
will
you
use
have
it.
to parse it before you tell the LSP about it. You
Okay,
don't tell the
I gotta-
LSP the whole thing.
I got a few comments and I got an appointment in a few minutes, so I gotta leave. But the few things I want to say is I'm using SIMD JSON just because it's a C++ like library. Because I could probably find a C library, but
No.
there's no
You
reason.
grabbed a JSON parser, fine. It had SIMD in the
Yes.
name, so I hassled you, fine.
Yeah, the license is SIMD JSON license is fine. The library, the API is fine. It's all good. Like I didn't pick it for performance. I just picked it because it was a good choice. The other thing is, yes, what you get from LSPs and dApps is just like craziness, and it doesn't matter what the standard says. I'm sure I'll run into like differences and mistakes and non-standard input from dApps. The other thing is if I'm trying to avoid using the C printf or scanf, I'm not even sure how to parse doubles, like because all the numbers are doubles in JSON. They're supposed to be doubles anyways. I don't think you're supposed to have a
Double parsing is a bitch.
Nope.
If you want the
That's
number
incorrect.
really, yeah, you need to go to library.
So the JSON spec basically. Sorry, go on because you have to go. I'll complain afterwards.
So the thing is, I once looked up how to parse a double, and you get like 100 digits, and like the biggest double is 100 digits. I could not figure out how to do that. And another issue I had was I tried to parse the float literals, and there's a few bits that just don't make sense, and the last few bits of regular numbers just don't make sense to me. You have to do some advanced math that I just don't understand, and didn't really need to deal with at the moment.
Grab a library.
Yeah, but anyways, see you guys.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Yeah, like the thing about JSON numbers is that Python is happy to put bigints in JSON numbers, and JSON is happy to support that. And even though they mention JavaScript object notation, JSON, they still don't like do what they say they do. And it's really goofy. It's actually impressive that you can't represent numbers reasonably in JSON. Like there's just no consistency to it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing in terms of the complex math about converting strings to numbers. It really doesn't fucking matter because you're already screwed by using JSON. Like,
yes,
it's completely destroyed. By the time you see any data, it's already like destroyed any semblance of correctness. Like, what are you trying to prove? Like that you can turn the incorrectly formatted data in JSON into magically correct data? You can't do that. There's no such thing.
The only correct output of JSON is big rationals for numbers. That is the actual, like the only universal output is big rationals.
Yeah, nope.
So no, that is the only correct universal output.
RC whatever it was, right? So I agree. Like the mistake it made in the spec, it does not specify an upper bound for the numbers. So it doesn't say, hey, integers are 64 bits. It basically says numbers match the IE float spec, and then it goes on like, hey, it's up to consumers to basically decide if they want to install additional limitations on that so that it fits within their standard integer.
Yeah, so the only way you can guarantee that you have every possible IEEE float encoded is using a big rational. That's the only data type that can encode every possible IEEE float, because you could have a 2000-bit float that has a 1000-bit mantissa, and all of a sudden you have the necessary like bits to they literally just allow this, or like 3-bit floats. Like you can just encode 0, 1, -1. Sorry.
No, like I agree there in the sense JSON is messy. Like I recently, for example, what I did very related to this. In Inco standard library, it had a JSON parser, but it was still is your standard DOM parser. So you parse and you get a document tree basically. And what I've been working on is a documentation generator where my compiler spits out a bunch of JSON files containing, the classes, their methods, their documentation, that sort of thing. And then I have a separate tool written in the language itself that consumes that and turns into, this case, a static HTML website. And for that, what I didn't want to do was load all those things into memory and then start sort of breaking it into the substructures that you actually need for the specific parts of generating the documentation and such. And I had for a longer time been kind of thinking like, okay, how would you do pool parsing in JSON? Terminology a little confusing, get to that in a sec. But so what I ended up doing is I broke it basically into two parsers. You have a pool parser and the DOM parser. The DOM parser is built on top of the pool parser. And the API is kind of similar to the typical SAX parsing APIs, where you just have like a while loop. You say, oh, if the current event is, curly open, then do this. But it's slightly more high level than that. So you basically say, hey, parse the next sequence of bytes as an integer and give me back a result that says, yes, this is an integer, or no, it was something else. And then there's some helpers we can say, hey, you parse an array, you give it a closure, and for each value that it finds, etc. It still validates, of course. But getting that to work was quite tricky in JSON because, for example, of how lenient it is about white space. So if you have let's say an object, you have your key : value, you can put white space before the colon, after, before the key, before the value, after the value.
Yeah, that's because white space doesn't change state. It just advances.
And that is fine for the DOM parser, but it's actually kind of annoying for the pool parser. Because what happens is you encounter a curly brace, you say, okay, give me the key. Well, you have to take into account that there might be white space before the key. So you can't just say, hey, the next thing I expect is a double quote, the start of a key. You have to first skip the white space. Then you parse the key, and you say, okay, we can't just expect a colon directly after the key. We have to say, first skip the white space, then get the colon. And so
everywhere, yes.
Right, in the parser, there's all these places where you say, okay, first skip the white space if there is any.
Yeah.
Then what you end up with is I have this type that you can use to make parsing objects a little easier. So instead of, because they're unordered, another issue with JSON, you can't say, hey, I expect an object, and the first key I expect is name, and then age, and then, etc. SimG JSON has an API that does that. It's not spec compliant because of that. Because the spec is very clear by saying ordering does not matter. So what you essentially do is there's a helper function that says, that basically just gives you, like it loops through the keys of an object, and it gives the key to a closure, and it's that closure's responsibility to then figure, okay, how do we parse the value for this key? And then there's a slightly more higher level API on top of that, so you can do like making sure that the types are checked. So you say, hey, this key, I expect the value of string. Once you've parsed it, do this thing with the value.
It sounds like all the difference between a generic JSON parser that takes all comers and a JSON parser that's, for instance, eating LDAP out.
Right, so it's kind of like the confusing thing here is I call it a pool parser. Some people call it a stream parser, but then other people say no, a stream parser is when it streamingly reads its input. Different people use different names. The point is basically, instead of just saying parse this thing, you say, hey, I want an array, parse an array.
Yeah.
And for each value, parse it as a string. And so it's a bit more verbose, a bit more explicit. But you don't have any intermediate values that you need to deal with, etc.
You're giving a spec to the parser, says this is the JSON I want.
Right, essentially. And the thing there is, in one particular case, so first what you want is if there's a parser error, you want the error to include, say, the byte offset. And again, you have to account for white space. So for example, if you parse a string and it's incorrect, ideally you want that error offset to point to either the start of the string or where you encountered the error, not after the string.
Right.
But if you put it to the start of the string, you have to take into account, hey, if there's leading white space, I want it to point to the double quote, not the leading white space.
AA error messages are full of these exact little diddly bits.
Right.
Here's where
so,
I ended the last thing. Here's the 0 or more gap of white space. Here's I start the new thing. Yes.
Yeah. And so with this sort of slightly higher level API that I built on top to parse objects, there's some code specifically where before it starts parsing the object, it records the offset. So that if you say, hey, I require these 3 keys and they are not present, it can point to the start of that object and say, hey, this object is missing these keys, rather than pointing at the end or wherever it ended up with.
Right.
In that thing, I have to still explicitly say, skip any trailing, any white space, so that when I get the offset, it takes it into account. It doesn't point to like a bunch of bytes before the curly brace.
Yeah. Welcome to error message handling in a parser.
Yeah. But so this is the point where you read that like, oh my God, I wish, we lived in a world like message pack or whatever was more popular than JSON.
No, JSON was intended originally to be written by hand until you got yourself,
Right. I understand where the popularity comes from. I think it's as a from the perspective of a consumer and producer, somebody who does not have to write the actual parser, I think JSON is perfectly reasonable, right? Ignoring the number sizes. But if you were to basically take JSON and you say, okay, numbers are either 64 bits floats or 64 bits ints, and maybe add comments, I think it will be perfectly fine. But as the author of a parser and dealing with all the nitty-gritty details is like, I wish we had something better.
And objects have all sorts of curveballs as well, because the order of the fields isn't specified. And some parsers are order specific and some aren't, and some producers are ordered careful and others aren't. And so, yeah, I mean, if you're trying to optimize, like arrays are fairly easy to optimize for. If they are uniform type arrays, but objects, like all bets are off. Plus metadata, there's no spec for, so it's like you have objects that carry metadata that they need for doing round tripping of serials. It gets really fast.
I think that's separate though. That's a trying to take a one-way protocol and do something else with it. You're just going to you're going to add some extra stuff because there's nothing baked in because it's intended to be like a storage format or whatever. It's not round trip between things.
Yeah. Right. I added a link to the doc that basically explores the challenges parsing JSON. One of the interesting things is it has a sort of test suite where they compared like a whole bunch of different implementations according to the RFC spec. And just the sheer number of them that fail in various scenarios or do like bizarre shit, it's a little scary. But this was very useful when I wrote the parser. I made sure it like passed all the tests.
Yeah, that sounds like a good thing. So I had to do a CSV parser for H2O, a parallel concurrent scale out CSV parser. And it turns out there's no real spec for CSVs either. And everyone does something a little different. And there's some really common ones you do, but there's a whole lot of range of things. And we burned a lot of time and energy on the CSV parser for H2O. And as a result, we could almost always inhale your CSV file and do the right thing in the first pass, but it was non-trivial. It was several people over the course of a couple of years and 10,000 varieties of CSV files to get to some semblance of reliability. It's pretty ugly. Simon, did you want to talk something about semicolons? We're going to change topics here.
Of course, always. I tried implementing optional semicolons in my language. This is basically now the second try.
So just interject, your volume is quite low. Can you crank it up maybe a bit?
I don't know. Better?
Maybe.
A little bit, just talk loudly.
Okay, so the call lesson from the first attempt I did a while ago was, yeah, if you want to share it, I just added some interesting examples.
Yeah.
So the call lessons from the first time was that I try to be too elaborate and had all these algorithms and inserting new lines and semicolon tokens into the token stream and trying to make sense of it. And it turns out for most parts of the language, you can really just make the semicolon optional and be done. And all the trouble one usually has with semicolon inference is when parsing expressions. So when parsing method bodies. And I'm now at the state of just having implemented all the like primitive make semicolon optional part. And the interesting thing is I got rid of almost all semicolon, but I also found a few corner cases where making something smarter would probably require the mentioned more sophisticated algorithm. And I have prepared those two, the Google Docs, and I wanted to show you them. The first one is it's like this value.method call, and it has a return with some parenthesized expression. And with optional semicolon and the usual expression-based language, you basically end up with the after example. And that's where it gets interesting, because at this point, the parser just says, well, you have a value method call parenthesis, and the parentheses that come after that are just another method invocation called on the results of value.method call.
You don't have you lost the keyword return, so it becomes
yeah. I mean that's what was like included in the changes, I'd
So
say.
can you explain why semicolons are a bad idea?
I mean, yeah, I mean it's extra stuff you simply don't need. I mean, if
So
you're really interested,
why do we have periods in written
because
language? Like,
a written language has very different rules and assumptions we are operating with. You have
because the
countless
way you write
amounts.
this, like there's an implicit semicolon because you're like, I'm going to the next line, so I'm stopping this. So maybe, maybe the answer here is like, if you want it to be line oriented, make it line oriented. If you don't want it to be line oriented, then use punctuation. The point is, do the reader a favor, like fuck the writer for a second here. Like, do the reader a favor. Like, if I can look at that, I look at that, it's beautiful. I see the line ends, therefore the method call ends. I see the next line.
Yeah.
Like, let my brain be on my side. Don't torture the poor reader of the code.
Yeah.
Like saving a fucking keystroke is so fucking idiotic. I get, yeah.
I mean,
sorry.
how many lives have entering semicolon taken over the last 50 years?
One, he
I
was
mean, if you
British.
sorry?
So there is a prior example here, the R language, which also lets you do this skip the semicolon thing, but they have a very specific rule. If you have an unbalanced open or a pending method call or grouping, it carries on as the expression. And if you don't, like you don't here in the method call, it's done. The fact that you do not have a pending guy there is implicitly, you're going to get that semicolon right there. Whereas if instead you had this.
Yep. That's one of like the core rules of these more fancy algorithms study.
Yeah, then
If you have
walk away
like
from it. And in fact, I know why
if you
R
have
did it. This is for Cameron's benefit. The R did it that way is because people started life using R scripting, and they would write a line, hit enter, expect it to execute. Write a line, hit enter, expect to execute. They got an answer they wanted. They swept the page of their commands and threw it in an editor and said, "This is the script to run." There were no semicolons at the end of the lines.
Yeah. So one thing what I wanted to say is that like the most inference algorithms have this rule that if you have an open parenthesis, no semis, no semicolon get inferred.
Then why are
That's-
you doing this
that's-
after guy as a run it all together? Why don't you just say no open curlies or no open parens, end of line, done?
Yeah, I mean, I don't agree with the outcome that the parser gives me in this case. It's like not the thing I want, but it's just interesting in the sense of here is what you get when you have like a really primitive implementation of semicolon inference.
See, I
And
kind of like
and-
I kind of like what Python did, which is they said, okay, we're gonna have an opinion on white space, right? And the reason they did it is because it's like this is gonna look good to the reader, right? And it's so it's not like there's one answer. Like I have no love for semicolons or whatever. I mean, they're okay, but like they serve a purpose, right? They help the reader. The white space in Python, it helps the reader. I know there are upsides and downsides to all these, like it's not religion though. Like it's about the reader of the code.
The
Right?
goal,
Yeah.
you're saying, think about the reader, not the writer. Prioritize the reader, not the writer.
Because the writer is a reader of their own code at some point as well. Like you read it 1 billion times for every time you write it.
I always read the code
Or-
that's in my head, not what's on the screen in front of me. That's a known issue.
Yeah. For
mean, I
reference,
totally-
Lua had this exact problem with method call and then parentheses after, and parsed it as 2 statements. And then people were like, "No, this is dumb. Why is that?" And then they started parsing it as 1 statement. And literally no one's code broke because no one would do this, because an expression with no side effect will stop that. Don't do that. Like
Right, breaking the call on 2 lines like you're doing here is actually like method call returns a function pointer, which then is being used to call another function. How often does that happen?
It happens.
I'd say it's more frequent than wanting just x over 5 on its own line.
Well, x over 5 is the return value.
I would just put a
maybe.
return word before that. If my code didn't type check, and then I'm like, well, why is it returning? Oh, and then I would be like, oh, return. I'd just put the return keyword
Now I'm
there.
in there like, AA says something about a function and has an arguments and does something and then whatever value.method. But then I'm going to demand a semicolon and then just the return. And in fact, that's it, right? You get a function right there.
Yeah, that looks reasonable to me. Putting it, yeah.
I do demand the semicolon if you're going to do it that way, yeah.
So the
I wouldn't want
point-
only some new lines to mean semicolon.
So I wanted to bring up the offside rule. So it's actually pretty simple. So like if it's indented like it is up here, then it's a continuation of the same line. And then if it's the same, if it's at the same level of indentation or if it's indented, then it's a new line.
This gets into the whole reader versus writer. If I'm looking at the code and trying to figure out what it means, for me, the indentation means a nested thing, and not the indentation means it's done. And I'm looking for that semicolon because I don't like Python's rule. But I would claim, I guess you're after as it sits right now looks kind of reasonable, but I would never write it that way. That's still, I don't know, in my head that looks reasonably uglier.
There's a language out there called Z who uses only indentation as their only thing.
Right.
Like if your word is 3 letters long, you do a 4 indent after it to make it an argument. It's indentation is in moderation. Should be.
Should be in moderation. Yeah. Right.
So
I have a
what
question originally for Simon, I guess, because I feel I got a bit sidetracked here. Like, were you originally going towards sort of discussing your like your experience or a solution, or so?
Why
Because
are
I
you
had
here?
these exact same things, so I'd be happy to sort of share my experiences there, but just to sort of, I guess, get things back on track.
I mean, the only thing I wanted to say is that in the very beginning, Cameron made a good point that the reader is more important than the writer. And I mean, I agree with that. But at the same time, figuring out or showing to the reader where the line ends. So, I mean, we have computers for that. We don't need to press that key as a writer to display it to the reader. Some languages with semicolon inference also had like an ID where you could toggle a button and then it displayed where the compiler inferred the line ending or the end of the expression. And that's basically the best approach, in my opinion, where we let the compiler figure things out, because the compiler has to figure these things out anyway. And the compiler shows the results it got in the IDE to the user, and that requires no effort on the writer side, and the reader gets all the benefits. And that's basically where I want to be with that feature. And yeah, I mean, the outcome of like the method call example is we really just meant to say, hey, I implemented this simple thing. It went reasonably well, like 98%, no problems. But I have two counter examples that don't work very well with that primitive algorithm. And one of them is that it basically ignores new lines, because new lines are just white space and ignored in the lexer. So even if the parser wanted to make the distinction based on there's a new line between those parenthesized thingies, it couldn't at the moment. And that's where basically the more advanced algorithms extend things. And yeah, I mean, and the other example I wanted to show is basically there was this rule previously or the parsing approach that just said, well, if there is a return and after the return there is a semi, then it's returning void or returning unit or something, and otherwise an expression will be there. And if I say, okay, I want to get rid of the semi, the compiler at the parser is unhappy because it says, well, there is no semi there. I expect that an expression is following. And I mean, that problem is, of course, more trivial to solve than the first one, but it's also an example of a side effect I didn't expect, or I didn't think of when I first implemented this primitive approach. And yeah, that's all I learned, I guess.
Dude, Bella, you got quiet again. I'm wondering if your mic moved. Just what it is.
I can add a little bit there. Like I very much in the camp of not so much screw semicolons, but I find that they are basically noise. I understand where they come from. I understand from the parsing perspective, it makes things simpler. But from the reading perspective, I think they're just useless noise. Sorry. So in Inco, it's very similar to this. Like the expressions are essentially, they're not always line delimited in the sense that if you have your array bracket and then the value is on the next line, it obviously parses that as part of the value. But if you do something like return new line 42, that gets parsed as a return without a value rather than returning 42.
Mm-hmm.
And getting that to work is actually rather tricky because you have to look at the line numbers in the parsing stage. So basically what happens is you...
Wait, say again? You return with 42 on the next line over?
Yeah, for example. So in this case, that's basically two expressions. A return expression without a value, because in the language, if you just do a return, it's
I claim that I had to deal with this doing the R parser I did and return just demands an expression. So,
Right, that's one option. So and that definitely simplifies it.
okay.
In my case, a pattern you quite commonly have is you have a function where at various stages you want to return early, but the function itself doesn't really return anything. Like it mutates some arguments in place, for example. And what I don't like is having to write something like return nil or return null or whatever it will be. So I made this decision that, hey, if you do return without any value, it is synonymous to return nil. And of course, the compiler will throw an error if the method actually returns something of a different type. But that means you have to make the value optional. So you get these parsing issues where you encounter a return keyword.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just blindly parse the next value as, say, an argument for that keyword. You have to basically look at the starting token, and then you say, hey, does that start on the same line as we end?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we treat it as part of the return expression. If not, it's a separate thing. But there are kind of cases where it's just a little tricky to deal with. I had this other similar rule where if you have a function call, the arguments go in the parentheses, and you could put a closure after the closing parentheses. So you would have add it quickly to the doc. You'll have something like I'll do that the last one. So foo 10 20 fn added it to the last code block. But the idea was basically if you have a function call with a bunch of arguments, you can stick the closure outside of it, and then in certain cases it's a little more readable. Sort of a relic from when the language is a bit more inspired by Ruby. That is also surprisingly difficult to parse. So that got thrown out recently, and that's no longer valid syntax.
We're in the
But then
doc.
fun enough, when I wrote a parser for this language in treesitter, parsing the return expressions with optional values is actually quite tricky. Because you declare in a grammar, and in that grammar, you do not have access to things like line numbers. So you can't say, hey, only parse this next thing if it's in fact on the same line. You have to resort to some kind of crazy precedence hacks. I still don't fully understand it, but it works. So it's in one of this case, like, it works, don't touch it. Because basically what would happen is you would have, say, return on its own line. And then on the next line, you'd have a closing curly brace. So you just basically a function just has the return keyword in it, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Treesitter would try to parse that curly brace as a value to the return expression. And then it would be like, well, there's no rule defined for that. So, what do we do? And so you basically have to, let me very quickly look up how I worked around that, because it is...
For people who aren't aren't watching the video over there, we're hacking return flavors in the code blocks, so you can see a bunch of choices about, hey, what about this, what about that, and here's how R does it, but other people do it different ways.
Can you scroll down to Eric's example? Or
Yeah, it's at the bottom.
is it?
Which one?
That was the closure one. Yeah, looking at the grammar, there's, without going too much into how treesitter works, it has some rules on how you can set precedents, like left-right precedents, but also sort of the ordering of rules within that. And so essentially what it does, it says, hey, if I have a return keyword followed immediately by white space, followed by so it basically says a return expression is the return keyword followed by an optional sequence of what I'm about to describe. And that starts with one or more spaces followed by an optional expression. So it's like an optional of an optional. And then you have to like fiddle with the precedence, and then it works. But that took me, I don't know, a couple of hours, a day or so to figure out. And it's made more complicated by the fact that you can't just look in an existing grammar, because a lot of the languages, what they do, they use a custom scanner for their tree sitter parsers in C. So that's where they handle all this logic, like, oh, it only is valid if this. And so you look at the grammar, you're like, I tried this, it didn't work. What's the magic? Oh, wait, they use a custom scanner. Great. It's, 2,000 lines of custom C. I'm not going to look at that.
That's
I
where you
guess
always write hand roll recursive descent. These problems all go away.
Yes, that's why I don't use parser generators myself, but tree sitter, that's how it works. You have to use it.
Fine. What was the trying to be expressed in the last line? Foo 10, 20, FN of open.
So it's a bit of a relic. I got rid of it recently.
Okay.
So what used to be the case is in the very early days, you could write function arguments without
Without
parentheses.
And FN is
Closure.
Oh, you're passing a closure.
Right.
You're passing a closure in as an argument?
Yeah, so this is essentially the same as FN with parentheses like that.
Yeah, but in the above example, you
Right.
have the FN
So-
following, not inside the parens.
I'm getting there.
Ah,
So this syntax of optional parentheses got scrapped pretty quickly because it's
Okay.
kind of a pain to parse, and it's also
a
one of
pain
the
to
things
read,
where
too.
you at some point you realize like, yeah, it's nice, but do I care about it that much? No, let's just get rid of that complexity. So what I ended up doing was if you don't specify arguments, the parentheses can be left out. So you can just do foo or foo parentheses, they're the same.
Mhm.
If you have one or more arguments, parentheses are required.
If you have no arguments and you just throw down foo, when do you mean I want the function value versus I want to evaluate the function?
So in my case, you can't take functions by value. So that solves that
there you
problem, right?
go. Okay.
Because they're all methods, they're always bound to something. But so what basically happened is if I have, say, a function call that only takes a closure as its argument, back then, I was of the opinion it is nicer if you can leave out the parentheses. Especially if you have these sort of DSLs that rely on closures. And also back in the early days, closures, the syntax did not have the FN keyword. It was just curly braces.
Yeah, that's my syntax, no FN keywords.
So kind of like small talk. And in that
we'll take
sense,
that a function call with one argument. Yeah.
Right. And so in that setup, it kind of makes sense because then it reads nicely. It kind of looks like it's part of the syntax, even though it's just functions and closures. But sort of incrementally, I moved away from that because it's just a pain to parse. And eventually, I was basically left with that one remaining rule where closures can be specified outside of parentheses because certain cases that's nicer. But the reason I got rid of that is when I wrote a code formatter, it was actually really difficult to format that kind of code automatically, reliably.
Sure. But what happens if you have multiple function closures intermingled with multiple other arguments?
Right. That's the thing. This will only apply to the last closure.
Okay, fine.
So that was also another case was like, yeah, I don't like these exceptions.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And so now it's just what other languages do, like arguments go in parentheses, closures the same, makes formatting a hell of a lot easier, although formatting properly with closures is still pretty tricky. Because you get these things where if you have, a bunch of arguments and then a closure, if the body of the closure fits on a single line, I would prefer to put it on like the next line so that instead of like breaking each argument across lines, it's
right.
different story, but yeah.
No, I know what you're talking about. I mean, I end up writing Lambda closures in Java all the time, and there was an indentation, couple options, and they're kind of like twitchy, a little this, a little that.
Right. But so with all these changes, kind of the point I was getting to is that
Hey, Simon,
if I remember correctly, the only place where the lack of semicolons is tricky is if you have return keywords or any keyword with an optional expression, basically. Because that's where you need to check, hey, is it on the same line?
Right.
And the second one is if you have an identifier followed by a space, followed by parentheses, some values in it, you have to determine, is that an argument or is that a tuple? A tuple passes an argument, or is it like a separate expression?
Oh, I fixed that in AA by claiming I only ever passed one argument, and it was commonly a tuple.
Right. So if you have
Oh,
like foo space
Uh-huh.
parentheses with two values, like,
Right.
okay, that could be two arguments to the foo function.
Right.
It could
I
be
said
a
it was
tuple.
one argument of a tuple always, every time.
Right.
And foo internally, syntactically sugared, took the tuple and broke it.
Right. I think what I ended up doing in this case, it will, I believe, also I will believe it treats it as arguments. I don't remember off the top of my head.
Right.
If I'm
I
looking
said
at
no multi-argument functions. They only ever take one. It's a tuple, and then I'll break it apart and give you syntactic sugar.
right,
That
yeah,
makes
that
this
also works.
parsing and unambiguous, right? There's only one way to go here. You call
Right.
foo, you're passing it in the middle line, you pass it with a function, one argument, that's fine. You call foo, you pass one argument, it's a tuple, and foo has internally declared multi-args, then I'll break it apart for you. And that was to remove the parsing ambiguity here.
Yeah, I took a
One-
quick look. So the space, it will treat it as arguments. If it's on the new line, it treats it as a separate expression still.
Yeah, that's the semicolon versus not, and
Right.
I'm saying have a semicolon, and so I don't have that parsing ambiguity. Simon was going to say something. Alan, was that you? Simon?
Oh, yeah, one thing I was wondering, Yorick, you mentioned that you're looking whether you have a like you're basically breaking the expression, the optional expression parsing, as far as I understood, on a new line. So if you have a return, then you have a new line, then the stuff on the next line doesn't count. And I think, isn't that like making the minority case more prominent than like the normal case? Because from my perspective, if you have a return and if you have stuff below that, that is dead code. It's never being useful in any kind of real practical example. So from my perspective, it makes more sense to say, okay, if I have a return, I treat new lines as white space and ignore them and basically read on and come either to the conclusion, okay, the next token is a closing curly brace, then I really know that I am returning nothing, or there is something there, then the something that is there has to be an expression that belongs to my return. What's your thought on that?
Right. No, so the case where you have like a return and then a bunch of code, that's mainly like debugging. So if I have like a function, a bunch of code, I'm like, hey, you know what? Actually, I want to try something different. I will sometimes just slap a return before that code and then do the actual code before it.
Comment it out.
Yeah, or you comment it out, right? It's not a super common case. It's more that I think it's a little less relevant nowadays with my syntax gradually becoming more strict. But there were certain cases where you have essentially a nested expression, and then somewhere it contains just a return keyword because you want to bail out early, say as part of pattern matching or something. Depending on what the syntax is that might come after, it's you don't want to mistakenly think, hey, that's part of the return expression. It is a little less relevant today. I'm trying to see if I can, off the top of my head, I can't think of cases where you legitimately have a return keyword and a bunch of code and you want to keep it because the compilers already complain like, hey, that code is unreachable, what the hell are you doing?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that was...
It's more so that you can simply have a return without a value. And that sort of requires you to check. With that said, I might at some point move away from that in the sense that instead of having to do something like if whatever return, you'd have to do if whatever return nil. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure yet on that one.
the question I'm asking, I'm asking the question. Sorry, Kramer. I'm asking the question because usually when people criticize semicolon inference, they bring the JavaScript approach to the table where the return and the new line and the expression gets parsed as separate things. And people say, and that's why we don't want to have semicolon inference, because look at JavaScript, it does silly things. And I think the argument for typed languages is only partially there because your compiler can, of course, tell you that you made a mistake there. But I'm still, I mean, I think I'm still partially convinced that that avoiding the JavaScript approach, even if the compiler can give helpful error messages, makes a bit more sense compared to like saying, okay, we are passing this differently, but the use cases for that are not sure what are kind of limited. For instance, like you said, about if I'm debugging things or something like that. Yeah, sure.
No, I have to head out, but I'll quickly buy. I think my opinion can be summed up that in a statically typed language, I don't think there's really a need for semicolons or any sort of statement delimiter. Because you basically don't need it. In the rare case where expression 1 and expression 2 gets parsed as a single one, the compiler will likely say like, "Hey, the type doesn't match" or something like that.
You're saying you're going to use type inference to tell you when it's time to.
No. So if you look, for example, at Inco, where if the return keyword always required a value,
right,
there would not be a need to look at line numbers.
So look at the Simon's expression, very first example, where he just has a run on because there's no semicolon.
Yeah.
And then now, if in fact the run on is happening and you don't want it to, what's your fix if you don't have a semicolon?
Well, so in the after, for example, if that's what you're referring to, they're on separate lines. It's not so much the.
They're on separate lines.
So the way I parse it is not so much by line numbers. Essentially, what it does, it parses a value method call. It sees the parentheses. It's like, okay, we're done parsing a method call. Then it sees a grouped expression. It doesn't care if they are on the same line or a separate one. It's the way it parses it, they're just separate expressions.
Right. So method call returns an int. That's not a valid function that takes an x over 5 as an argument. So this is an error. The compiler tells you it's an error. As a programmer, I want to correct it. How do I correct it? What's the strategy? Add a semicolon. No semicolon.
It's an error in what sense? In that
it's a simple type error. Method call returns void. I can't just call it as I can't run it together.
So Inco doesn't give a shit. Like all methods, they always return an expression. Yes. Nil is the default one.
I'm sorry. So it returns nil. Now I have nil next to an x over 5.
Well, why would it?
Isn't that a type error?
No, hold on. Maybe we're hold on. Let me get the code block. So let's say what happens is that value.method call returns nil. X divided by 5 is, I guess, int. If I were to stick this in, say, a function,
let me change the after a little bit. Assuming that the white space and the new line aren't there and aren't getting looked at, I end up with this.
Right.
Which I don't want. This is the incorrect. I really want this.
Right.
With the semicolon. Okay, what is my go-to strategy if I don't have a semicolon?
Well, in this case, Inco, this works fine. Like value.method calls nil, it gets ignored because the value is not used for anything. Then it evaluates the grouped expression and says, oh, that returns int, so I guess that's our return value.
Okay, now suppose method call returns me a function that takes an int.
You have to call it, in case of Inco, closures have to be called explicitly with a call method that you call on it. So there's no sort of,
Okay.
oh,
Can't chain returning a function and then immediately calling the next with it.
so the way it works in Inco, let's say you have, I'll go to the bottom code block. Let's say you have,
Yeah,
you
let
know,
me undo my changes here so that we keep the original. Okay, I'll go down to the bottom code block.
right. So let's say you have, you know, example function parentheses. Sorry, let's do the returns closure, for example.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And then I do, I don't know,
And then you
10,
put some args. Yeah, 10,
20.
20, done. Yeah.
That gets, the way this gets evaluated, it's just a closure that's not used for anything. So it's discarded. And then it says, oh, there's a tuple with 2 values. Okay, that's it.
So I can't
Right,
make
there's
a call.
no sort of automatic querying, I don't know how you would call it. Right,
Okay.
if I want to actually call that closure, what I have to do is stick.call at the end. And in this case, because of how the syntax is parsed, 10 and 20 is parsed as the argument.
Yeah, no problem now. I get it now.
Right.
All right, so you have an Inco solution.
Right. It's I guess this is a problem if you have this language where if an expression returns a closure and something that follows it looks like arguments, we automatically evaluate or something.
C code, for instance. So you can returns closure could return a function and then
yeah, no, so they can, but I think you still, in case of C, what you would have to do here is you'd have to parse it. I don't know if it's white space sensitive in that sense.
Well, I mean, if I have C, then C has its own rules. Ignores all white space. You put this adjacent, he's going to make a function call and carry on. That's fine for C because
I think in this case, what you could do is say, oh, if I have a expression followed by parentheses, for that to be treated as arguments, there must be no space in between, for example. So it would have to be like that.
So I'm going to change the edit it a little bit here, like the way it is now with no spaces. But if I were to go edit it like this, then it would instead say, I evaluate this for side effects only, eval for side effects. And then this is the return from the outer function because it's a standalone, right?
Yeah. So put it this way, the way it works in Inco is essentially the end of the line is a semicolon. That's the best way to see it.
Okay.
I'm wondering, so you're probably not supporting like this, like method chaining where you put the dots on the next line.
Yeah.
Yeah. So hold on.
Yeah, you can undo that. That's just me.
No, it's like I try to click and goes like spelling suggest. Like, no, go away. I just want there we go. So well, you can do something like I don't know, let's say user.new.do whatever.
But you're saying dot function name, dot
stuff.
Whatever. Yeah.
I'll add the parentheses just for the clarity's sake here.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So that's just a single method chain. But do you mean that you want to put the dot on like the end or something, or
no? I had exactly this example in mind because you said you're treating a line ending like a semi.
Right. So I should correct myself there.
In this model,
for return statements, sorry, return expressions, the end of the line terminates the expression. But basically everything else, it doesn't give a shit.
I think one thing that's going on here is that user.new ... returns an object, which you can then get a method call out of. And that returns an object, but you can do more stuff as another method call. So
but the parser doesn't know that.
No. So the parser logic here is basically it. Let's simplify this a little bit. Let's say you do 10.toString.to upper parentheses for the sake of it, right? So what happens? It parses 10 as an expression. It then does a look ahead to the next token. It says, oh, it's a dot. Okay, we're parsing a method call, right? So then it expects some identifier, some arguments. Then it says, hey, what's the next thing? Oh, again, it's a dot. And it's sort of the early expressions go deeper into the call tree, basically. It's left recursive. So basically, outside of the return expression, nothing in the parser gives a damn about line numbers. Just because in return expression, the value is optional, that's where it has to check, hey, does that value, in fact, exist on the same line?
But I mean, if you have a look ahead anyway to check what's coming next, you could use this approach for return, right? I mean, then you wouldn't need to have a separate rule set just for return, but you say, okay, there's return, and we need to have a look anyway, just like with in-chain method calls, whether there's a dot or not. You check in return whether there is a closing curly brace as a next token. If there isn't, well, then it has to be an expression.
Right, so there is still a check. So the parsing logic specifically, it encounters a return keyword. It then says, basically notes down the line number. It looks at the next token, and it says, hey, 1, is that on the same line as the return keyword? 2, is that token the valid, a valid starting token of a single expression?
Mm.
So in other words, if you have return closing curly brace, for example, it will know, hey, no expression starts with a closing curly brace.
Yep.
So we're just not going to parse that. Yeah, so there is still a check, but it's for that case we have return, new line, and then, I don't know, 42.
Yeah, that's what I had in mind. If you just drop the first part of a check where you say, well, is there a new line or not? You'd probably end up with a more consistent rule set and wouldn't have the special case for return.
Right. No, I think at this point
mind.
I can probably drop this rule. There were a bit more cases syntactically where it could get a little confusing. But I think if I were to make that change, I would probably take it a step further and make it so that the return keyword requires a value. So they have to write return nil instead of just return. Because then it also is more consistent with some other rules, and then you the whole parsing rule becomes much more straightforward because it's just return keyword expression. That's it.
And from a more dogmatic perspective, which is mine, I'd say if people want to write side affecting functions, their syntax shouldn't be shorter than people writing non-side affecting functions. So basically saying, well, you need to write return parenthesis open parenthesis close or something is a good punishment for writing side affecting. That's
fine. Making it harder to write and harder to read for some notion of purity. I think find some other way to establish or put natural consequences for writing such things.
Yeah, I mean, we have millions. I mean, in general, it's like the same thing for like function syntax for functions that return a value versus functions that don't return a value. We have like millions of types, and all of them, depending on the language, require that you write down what type you return. And there's like a single privileged type called void where you get the nice syntax, despite like we all know that like side affecting functions are probably not the main use of functions in any kind of language today. And I'm just all right.
I don't buy that one. Fine.
I'd say that side affecting functions are not in the majority anymore, regardless of the language you're writing in.
If you don't change something, then nothing changed. And that's the whole point of doing something, is to get something to change. So somewhere somebody's doing a change. Yeah, I think we can wind this down and argue side effects are not the side effects. I've watched plenty of folks fight for fully pure languages, and still that's not how the world works.
I'm not arguing against that we shouldn't have like side effects or anything. I'm just saying that we're giving a syntactic bonus to some special kind of method that just isn't that used that much anymore.
No, I think they're used plenty, but they may not be over 50%. But I bet you if you go look at, any large code body, there's a significant fraction that do side effects. Separately,
Yeah, okay.
if you
Yeah, I
just
mean then
just declare everyone returns all the time something, and they can have a nice cheap ass return of 0, nil, or whatever, then you remove the whole notion of what is this thing I'm returning. It just always return, whether or not I return something, you're always returning something. That's one thing to do. And then I'm doing type inference, so I don't care. You don't have to name the type of your return, especially if you're returning nil or empty or void or whatever you want to call it. For me, it's always nil. And it infers immediately, instantly, obviously, and you don't have to say I'm returning this. So I think there's a solution here for I'm a function that has side effects, and so I don't want to return. I want to return nil or whatever, void. I want to return something
yeah,
cheap because I'm
yeah.
only in it for the side effects.
Yeah, I mean it's really just not giving syntactic sugar to like one special case. And that's
I
all
don't think
I'm
it's a
arguing
special
about.
case. Fine.
I mean, if for instance, like in some languages that use strings a lot, why aren't the methods or functions in that language getting the nice function syntax treatment for string instead of void methods or something, right?
Maybe they are.
Yeah, maybe.
Very abstract function, a very abstract language here. Like, what's this language?
I mean,
So if you just return the last expression and you need to return, and you're in a function that returns something exciting, you have to put the expression you're returning. If you're in a function that returns void or nil because you're in it for the side effects, well, then just return the last thing, and you don't care what the last thing is because it's not part of the useful signature.
yeah.
So you don't have to name anything, and I think that's exactly like the minimalist you can do. If you're going to return something, you have to put the expression you're returning, and if you're not going to return something, you do nothing. All right, fine.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah, so
unconvinced, both
sort some more examples out, like this 42, our return 42 variations we went through. I think we beat it to death. I think I think you're headed for what ours already come to. But I don't care really. I like my semicolons. Although I understand that you don't, and I understand why our people went the way they did, where they don't have a semicolon either. But it does complicate your parser because you have to choose.
yeah, absolutely.
Break the line or done.
I mean, we don't need to discuss it anymore, but I added a link at the top of the page for those interested.
Yeah, I didn't want to
to a
scroll up and add
website,
links. So people added links. Where
to a
semicolon
website
parsing.
that basically lists various languages and their approaches. And I didn't try all approaches for my first try a long time ago, but I have some rough idea where I want to end up with my approach. And I think, yeah, there's like, you get 95% there with like a very primitive approach.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you want to do anything nicer, there will be a jump in complexity.
Yeah.
But if you basically pick the heuristics right, you will be able to eliminate all those weird special cases without really having to deal with surprises or having to,
there is a deal there where keeping the simple heuristic removes the surprise count, and you deal because you have to, but you understand why you're dealing and where you're dealing because there's no
Yeah.
weird heuristics that work here and not there. So I actually am a fan of the keep the rule really simple. The rule that says I got a return keyword and nothing on the line. The next line has an expression or it has a closed curly. I'm done, right? I can tell.
Yep.
And nothing else. Like super stupid. You ended it, or if you're starting with an open paren, there's like a really small count of rules because I have to have it in my head when I'm reading the code and when I'm writing the code.
Yeah, I mean, you have to have, I think there is a bare minimum of heuristics you need because, for instance, you have those examples with like method chaining with you basically don't want to have a different behavior depending on whether you put the dot on the ending line or the dot on the next line at the beginning. And another example are basically all the binary expressions. You also don't want to have different behavior whether you put the minus or something on the end of the line or the minus at the beginning of the line, because if you have overlap between binary operators
As soon as
and
right.
unary operators, you will get even
Yeah.
more in trouble if
Right,
there is
right.
disagreement.
No,
It's
that's why I'm
like,
saying simple, so that I can
Yeah.
tell, and then sometimes the writer just
Yeah.
puts a semicolon down, damn it, and he has to.
so
All right,
yeah,
I'm gonna call it
all
here.
right.
I got things to do. We long run down parsing of semicolons. I think we beat that horse to death. All right. Till next week.
Goodbye.
Bye.
So, yep.